right. Well, thank you so much, Amy, and thank you everyone for joining us today for this webinar on timely warning analysis. My colleague Laura Egan and I are so happy to be with you. We see a lot of, we always like to say familiar faces, but in this case it's familiar names on the registrant list. And this is a topic that we really get a lot of requests from institutions about. We know that this is something that your campus community might be asking you questions about, and we hope that some of the takeaway from this webinar will be you thinking about ways that you might message differently in relation to timely warning. My name is Abigail Boyer. I'm the Interim Executive Director here at Clery Center, and I want to take a pause to see if Laura can take some time to introduce herself as well.
Hi, Abby, can you hear me?
I can.
Abby, can you hear me? Okay, great. Sorry, I was really talking. So I'm so sorry that you had to do the beginning introduction unexpectedly. Thank you. I think I maybe was accidentally muted. But yes, I am Laura. I am so happy to be joined by Abby today and get a chance to speak with all of you a little bit about timely warnings and how we think about communicating them and their intention to our campus community and how we could maybe refine those practices further. And Abby, I'm happy to continue to move on with the introduction if that is okay for you.
Wonderful.
Great, thanks so much. So just a brief touching on our Clery Center mission and values. We do this intro at the beginning of every webinar just because we know that sometimes folks are joining us for the first time, or this might be the only webinar you're participating in for National Campus Safety Awareness Month. But we don't want to spend too much time on it for those that have already heard it. But what we really do want to stress is how Clery Center is a nonprofit training organization that really is working intentionally together in partnership with colleges and universities to better understand what the Clery Act requires and how to best implement those regulations or requirements on your own campus, taking into consideration your own unique campus culture. We really think that our work is distinguished by the concept of thinking through both the letter and spirit of the law and creating action steps around the idea of leading with both mind and heart. We think those things are really aligned. We all have gotten into this work for a reason. Safety or prevention or care of a community is important to us for some reason. And so we really find it helpful to ground ourselves in remembering why we started the organization and what the work that we do every day with our organization and on your campuses aims to achieve. And I think for everybody, we would say that we're on the same page in wanting to create safer spaces for all people and creating a stronger community on our campuses. We always like to just spend a moment too reflecting on the namesake of the Clery Act as well as our organization, and that is Jean Clery. Jean was a student at Lehigh University when she was raped and murdered in her first year there in April of 1986. And her parents, Connie and Howard, have worked to rectify that loss in some capacity by developing both legislation. So at the state and local level, they developed legislation that turned into the federal law that we know today as the Clery Act. And they also founded our organization in an effort to support work around increasing crime awareness and transparency on college campuses, as well as supporting education, response, and prevention efforts around campus safety and crime. And we do take a moment to reflect on Jean because, like I said earlier, we all started this work for a reason, and that might be because of a person or an experience. But for us, we think about Jean every day, and we walk into our offices and see an image of her, and we're reminded that she, sadly, is just one of many lives that have been lost to violence, whether on campuses or not. And we know that her mother, Connie, is really connected to wanting to make sure that we can prevent any other loss. And so when we thought about this year's theme for National Campus Safety Awareness Month, we wanted to spend some time really making sure that folks understand how powerful their words can be, especially when it comes to explaining what services you offer or why you take the action steps that you do take on a campus. We know that, in particular, timely warnings are a really contentious issue at times on a campus, because some people fully don't understand their intention or their purpose, or they do understand their intention and purpose and just don't agree with that. And so campuses are really always struggling to meet the needs of individuals versus the community. And so in thinking about loss of individuals like Jean and then balancing the safety of individuals with the safety of the overall community, we know that your messages around what you do are really important. And whether you think they're heard or paid attention to or not, we can tell you they certainly are, at a minimum when there is an emergency or a crisis on your campus. And so we spent this month really dedicating both our resources and our webinars to giving folks the opportunity to examine what messages they're currently using, to decide if they want to refresh or revise those messages at all, and then hopefully provide you with some opportunities and skills and resources and tools to do those things. And so today we're going to spend a lot of time talking about timely warnings in particular, but we have already spent some time talking about the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act and the Clery Act overall. And then we'll be ending our webinar series with next Thursday's webinar at the same time, noon Eastern time, reflecting on hate crimes and the Clery Act, and how hate crimes under Clery and bias-related incidents that might not rise to the level of a hate crime under Clery are distinct and different and require the same type of support and education. And so if you're interested in downloading any of our previously highlighted resources or listening to recordings of our previous webinars, please check out our website, naxam.clerycenter.org. You'll be able to see those things, download those pieces, and even download our social media guides for the remaining few days of NAXAM. As we go through all of our webinars, we're going to be talking about a bunch of these different resources, so we felt it would be helpful to highlight them for you all. Obviously, when we say the Clery Act itself, we are talking about the statute and then its implementing regulations, the statute being the law itself. The Handbook for Campus Safety and Security Reporting is a document that is published by the Department of Education. The Department of Education is the enforcement authority for the Clery Act. And they publish the handbook as a guide for campuses to use to understand how to implement the regulations on their own campuses. The handbook is technically what we would call sub-regulatory guidance in that it is not the law itself, but language in the handbook, right in the introduction, clearly states that if the Department of Education were to ever conduct a program review at your campus to determine whether or not you were fully in compliance with Clery, then that is the guide that they would be using. So we find it to be a very helpful resource to draw recommendations and examples from as campuses are navigating how they're best fulfilling Clery requirements. It is certainly not perfect. It's not a be-all, end-all space, but it's a very helpful starting place, and we reference it a lot through all of our webinars and trainings. We'll also probably mention WESTAT to you today. WESTAT is a federal contractor that provides technical assistance on the behalf of the Department of Education on the Clery Act. And so sometimes when we are asked very specific questions or questions that are nuanced around how to classify a CSA or a piece of geography or a crime, we will refer institutions to this organization. Because while Clery Center is in a capacity to answer technical assistance questions generally, specific questions tend to benefit from a more formal response or a response that is more closely connected to the actual enforcement authority. And so WESTAT is in that position to give you that more formal answer. And we provide their contact information here. It's really something that's very easily accessed. And then lastly, as I mentioned earlier, the Department of Education sometimes conducts program reviews of a campus's Clery compliance program. And the results of those reviews are published and available for the public at no cost. And so much of our education and training and resources derives information and lessons learned from those program reviews. Because for us, it's free information. You know, this is what the Department of Education notes as trends or common gaps that they see at campuses in terms of complying fully with Clery. So we use that information to guide our lessons that we're sharing with other campuses. But you are more than able to access that information as well. It is found through the Federal Student Aid website within the Department of Education. As Clery is tied to Title IV funding, the enforcement authority for the Clery Act is housed within the Office of Financial Aid or Federal Student Aid under the Department of Education. So what are we going to do today? So today we're going to first review what requirements exist under the Clery Act regarding timely warnings, so what campuses need to do for this particular aspect of the law. And then we're going to walk through a guide that we developed that we're humbly calling our Timely Warning Guide. We leave no secrets in our titles. But this guide was developed to walk through what we think are some helpful steps to consider if you're at a place where you want to freshen up your policy, or if you've been getting a lot of feedback or pushback on the language you use in your timely warnings, or how you even make a decision about issuing a timely warning. So we have developed about 6 steps that we'll walk through together that highlight action steps that we think you should consider, and then promising practices in each of the areas that we see other campuses using that might yield a very good positive result for you. And then lastly, we'll also spend time throughout the webinar identifying additional resources and campus partners that could assist you in achieving some of these goals around refreshing your timely warning messages. Today, you'll have the opportunity to participate with us in a variety of ways. Amy highlighted many of them already, but just as a quick refresher, you will have the opportunity to answer questions of us and also ask questions of us through the group discussion pod and the Q&A pod. So it's a way that you can pose questions, and then when we pose questions to you, you can answer through that group discussion pod. We'll also be doing a couple of polls throughout the training, and they will also come up in that group discussion pod. And we just ask for you to participate to the extent that you're comfortable. It helps us gauge the climate of the audience, where your questions are stemming from, and then also hopefully gives you a chance to see what types of questions other folks have and maybe how you could even answer their questions also. And then, like I said already, we're going to be walking through the resource that we've highlighted for today's webinar, our Timely Warning Guide. And you are always free to ask us questions either in the group discussion pod, or if you wanted to ask us a question privately, you could ask it through that private Q&A pod as well. So won't spend too much time on this, but we are talking about this law called the Clery Act. If you've never heard of that before, the Clery Act is a federal consumer protection law that all institutions of higher education in the United States that receive Title IV funding are obliged to comply with. This act was designed to be a law that provides some regulation and expectations around documenting crimes that occur in and around campus, college campuses, and then also provides some expectations and requirements around how campuses share that information with their students and staff, and what prevention and response looks like on those campuses as well. Under the Clery Act, there is a reporting authority that is identified that is called a Campus Security Authority, or a CSA, and those folks are required to pass along information about Clery crimes reported to them to whatever crime collection body has been designated at that institution. Additionally, campuses are required to reach out to local law enforcement to see if there were any Clery crimes reported directly to them that took place in a campus's Clery geography. Clery geography, everybody's favorite Jeopardy topic. Clery geography is a reference to the different types of buildings or property that institutions own as defined under the Clery Act. I should say own or control. So there are different categories under Clery geography. Some are more obvious than others, but on-campus property is one, on-campus student housing is another, public property immediately within or adjacent to your on-campus property is the third, and then lastly is non-campus property. So again, these are different categories of geography defined by the Clery Act itself that campuses need to use to categorize their own campuses, buildings or property that they own or control. The biggest thing to understand about non-campus property today is when we say non-campus, we are not referring to just off-campus property, but we are referring to buildings or property that an institution does own or control that are not reasonably contiguous to that core campus or that on-campus property. So a little bit further away, a standard that has become common recently is anything that is more than a mile away from the borders of your core campus could be considered non-campus property, again, that you own or control of. And then just to go to the what Clery requires you to do and how it requires you to do it. On an annual basis, the Clery Act requires that institutions publish a document called an annual security report. That report needs to be published by October 1st of each year, so that deadline is creeping up for folks this year. And that report contains information on certain policy statements, so summaries of existing policies and procedures around certain topics of campus safety, and then crime statistics. So the statistics in an annual security report represent reports of Clery crimes that occurred on Clery geography that were reported to a CSA for the 3 previous calendar years. So this year's ASR will have statistics from 2017, 2016, and 2015 in it. Annually, also, an institution is required to report those statistics directly to the Department of Education through filling out an online survey, and that deadline is usually a couple of weeks after the deadline to publish an annual security report. In an ongoing capacity, a campus is always responsible for analyzing whether or not a crime report that they receive requires an emergency notification. Well, let me back up. An emergency notification does not need to be connected to a crime per se, but campuses are always analyzing if an emergency notification needs to be issued depending on the circumstances that they receive about an incident taking place. They are also analyzing whether or not a report of a Clery crime that occurred within Clery geography poses a serious or ongoing threat to the campus community, in which case it would need to issue a timely warning. And we're going to spend some more time talking through that today. In an ongoing capacity, campuses also need to maintain a daily crime log if they have a security department. And that daily crime log represents crimes reported to the campus security department or police department that occur within the campus's patrol jurisdiction. And then lastly, there are certain rights and options that need to be provided to survivors of dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking, in addition to the fact that those crimes are included as Clery crimes that are counted in statistics as well. And that last addition is a result of the most recent amendments to the Clery Act, which took place back in 2013 with the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. And then those regulations or amendments have been in place officially since July 1st of 2015, so a little bit over 3 years now. And then lastly, just a final reminder, Clery Center is not the enforcement authority of the Clery Act. The Department of Education is. As the Clery Act is a consumer protection law, it is housed within the Federal Student Aid Office within the Department of Education. And within FSA, there is a Clery compliance team, a humble but mighty team of folks that enforce the Clery Act in terms of compliance. They conduct those program reviews. Okay, so that is enough of me talking. I will give you all the chance to tell us a little bit about yourselves. We'd love to do this type of a poll at the beginning of the webinar to get a sense of who is in the room and who has joined us today. So if you all could take a minute to complete this poll to let us know how you would identify on your campus in terms of your role and responsibilities. So we have campus police or security, student affairs folks, university communications, director of the health or counseling center, Clery coordinator, Title IX coordinator, or other. So as the results are coming in, it is super exciting to see so many Clery coordinators on the call. I know as recently as even a year ago, we didn't have as many folks with that title, so that is just super exciting in and of itself. But we do see there's a lot of campus police and security in the room, some student affairs folks, Title IX coordinators as well. For all those of you that are saying other, definitely feel free to include in the group discussion pod the role that you do have, so that way we can know who is attending and who we have maybe forgotten about. I see a lot of risk management folks. Okay, great. Or folks that maybe have more than one of these roles, which is certainly very possible as well. Or folks with a title that's connected to administrative compliance in general. Great. Awesome. Thank you so much, Amy. You can close that poll whenever you'd like. Awesome. Thank you so much. And thanks for all of you for taking the time to answer that poll. So now we're just going to ask you to take a second to answer this chat box question. What, if any, concerns or challenges with your institution's timely warning policy or procedures would you like to address? So magic wand, what would you like to fix about your institution's timely warning policy or procedures? Great, thank you so much for those of you that are starting to respond. So we see, I'm seeing questions like how to best document the decisions that you make around issuing a timely warning. Great question. What exactly is timely? So maybe having some more clarity around how you could, if at all, define that term timely. I see folks saying whether or not they'd want, I guess, some clarity, or they'd want to address the idea that timely warnings should be applied to off-campus locations. I guess maybe the question is that is currently the case, so maybe we want to adjust that, because we will highlight what timely warnings are required to be issued for and what they're not required to be issued for, so that's great. The number of people that have to okay it before sending it out, absolutely. That definitely is a constant concern that many campuses have, that timely warnings require multiple levels of approval before they can actually be sent out, which only delays that process further and makes it less useful for the campus community. So we're going to explore that today as well. How to issue during off hours where you might not have campus security or police actively working, absolutely. I could see that being a challenge. And then basically determining when a timely warning is needed or appropriate in the case of a sexual assault where the perpetrator is known to the victim, a very common concern as well. And then I see also some best practices around maintaining the data when you send a notification. So basically figuring out, do folks even read what we're sending? Are folks receiving what we're sending, et cetera? Thank you so much for taking the time to answer that question. Many of the concerns that you are bringing up are topics we plan to cover today anyway, but some of those are really great questions that help to highlight some areas that maybe we didn't think of so much either. So we're really appreciative to have those answers to support the rest of our discussion today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Abby, who is going to walk us through what timely warning requirements are. Thanks so much, Abby.
Great, thank you. And I think the really interesting thing about a lot of the things that you were commenting on and some of the things that were just shared in the group discussion is that these conversations that we're going to talk about today, so how do you do policy development, how do you develop structures and procedures to support your decision making, can sometimes be difficult within your campus community. Not to say that higher education ever navigates politics or has its challenges, but I think for a lot of you, I really appreciate seeing some of the concerns that are coming up, because I bet as other folks were reading the group discussion, they were nodding their head frantically. Even with some of the basics on, well, what should our policy actually say? And then how do we take our policy and apply it in a way that we feel as though it's being consistently applied, we understand our roles in being a part of that policy, and we feel as though we can communicate that more broadly to our campus community. So you'll notice in the resource that we're going to highlight today, the Timely Warning Guide, it really starts with the basics of, do we have a policy and what does that policy look like? And then really broadens into, okay, how are we having these broader conversations with other members of our campus community? So let's start by just exploring or revisiting what those policy requirements are under the Clery Act, specific to timely warnings. In other webinars, we've talked about the difference between timely warnings and emergency notifications. We're not going to be focusing specifically on emergency notifications for this webinar, but as Laura noted a little bit earlier, emergency notifications are when there's an immediate threat to the health or safety of the campus community. And so in your head, I want you to separate emergency notification from timely warning policy requirements, because your policies on your campus should make that separation as well. Timely warnings are for something very specific. Timely warnings are for situations in which a Clery Act crime was reported to a campus security authority, it occurred in Clery Act geography, and it represents a serious or ongoing threat to the campus community. So what does that mean? That means that if we were going by the minimum of what Clery requires, and we're looking at our own timely warning policy, we should see that the circumstances for when the institution issues a warning is that all four of those factors have been met, that there was a Clery Act crime from the list of our required Clery crimes. We know that we have the core primary crimes: murder, non-negligent manslaughter, manslaughter by negligence, sex offenses, rape, fondling, incest, and statutory rape. robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, motor vehicle theft, and arson. We have hate crime, so any one of those types of crimes, as well as the addition of larceny, theft, intimidation, destruction, damage, vandalism of property, and simple assault that's committed by one of the 8 bias categories. We have our VAWA offenses, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. And then we have arrests and referrals for drug law violations, liquor law violations, and illegal weapons possession. So the first thing we're asking ourselves is, did a Clery Act crime occur? Did that crime occur within our Clery Act geography, which Laura did a high-level overview, that geography specific to our institution, what we own or control in the categories guided by the Clery Act, our on-campus student housing, our non-campus, and our public property? Was the incident reported to a campus security authority or local law enforcement? So our campus security authorities are those individuals in our campus community that fit the definition of CSA, campus police or security, someone with a security function, someone who your institution points members of your community to report to as part of your campus policy, or those officials with significant responsibility for student and campus activities. And, so it's an and, does that incident that was reported to the CSA that took place in our Clery geography, does it represent a serious or ongoing threat to the campus community? So that's really our starting point when we're looking at our policies, is do our circumstances regarding when and how we issue a timely warning, do they take into account all of those 4 factors, and are we making that analysis on a case-by-case basis? So the law doesn't say every time a Clery crime occurs we issue a timely warning, but rather whether or not that Clery crime in Clery geography represents a serious or ongoing threat to the campus community. So that's the analysis that the institutions are charged with making, and that's where a lot of these other questions certainly come in. We know that the decision-making factor is really a lot of times what can cause additional conversation within the campus community, and maybe some misunderstanding or some confusion around what the requirements are. So in your annual security reports, which I know you all are finishing up right now for that October 1st release, some of you have already released it based on your campus communities and just what we know of your efforts. Your annual security report, as Laura mentioned, has a number of different elements, certainly your crime statistics for the previous 3 calendar years, but also those policy statements, and we often refer to those as the cliff notes of your policies or summary of your existing policy. But when we provide these summaries, we also look to the Handbook for Campus Safety and Security Reporting for what, and certainly the regulations themselves, for what information must be in that policy statement. Because your policies may be longer and broader than what you see in your ASR, but the policy statement at a minimum has to cover certain elements. So one is the circumstances under which the institution issues a timely warning, which, if your policy is specific to just those minimum Clery Act requirements, would be exactly what we just talked about. Clery crime, Clery geography, reported to CSA or local law enforcement, and represents a serious or ongoing threat to the campus community. Now, some of you are noting in the group discussion questions around, well, what about if there are incidents that happen outside of that Clery geography? Do we need to evaluate those for a possible threat to the campus community? So there are a couple of things you'll want to consider from that standpoint. It is possible to broaden your timely warning policy. So for example, the handbook does note that an institution could choose to broaden the scope of their timely warning policy to include consideration of other types of crimes or perhaps additional geography. One of the challenges that we would raise, should you choose to do that, is that you want to be sure your institution can consistently follow that policy. So what are the guidelines, what are the constructs through which you're going to make sure that if you broaden the geography for which you're sending a timely warning, that you're doing so consistently? More often, what we see are campus communities developing different policies or different structures where their timely warning policy is specific to what those minimum requirements are, and then they may have another policy or another structure, like a safety alert, for example, that can speak to scenarios where it doesn't meet the timely warning requirement, but the institution would still want to communicate with the campus community. The other thing that it's always important to recognize here too is that in addition to the timely warning requirement, there is also emergency notification, a policy that your institution must have in place as well, and that's broader than Clery Act crimes and Clery geography. That is for immediate threats to the health or safety of your on-campus community. So that could be things like a weather incident, a gas leak. There are a number of different types, an active shooter. There are a number of different types of threats that could fall in that category. So I think the question you want to ask yourself is, first, would the scenarios that we're talking about, the information that we're receiving, automatically fall within our timely warning or emergency notification policy? And if it doesn't, is it a change we want to make to our timely warning policy to go broader than what the minimum requirements are? Or is there another mechanism through which we would want to address these options or areas where we might want to do additional communication? The thing you'll want to consider when making that decision is the Department of Education, when they're doing program reviews, they look to how institutions meet these Clery Act requirements. And part of that review is really looking at, are your policies in compliance with Clery, and in these places where your policies might be broader than what Clery requires, are you still acting according to your policy? So if the Department of Ed would come into your institution and say, I want to see your timely warnings for these incidents that you reported in your annual security report, or if they say, I want to see all the timely warnings that your institution released over a specific period of time, you want to be able to, one, be able to produce that documentation, and we'll talk about that a bit today, but two, you also want to be confident that those decisions that you made, the information that you did send, really aligned with what your policy said. That doesn't mean, again, that every Clery Act crime in Clery Act geography is going to result in a timely warning, but you do want to make sure that you have documentation to say why you made the decision that you did, either issuing that warning or not issuing that warning. So when you're looking at the policy itself, and I know there are a number of questions coming in for the group discussion. Laura and I will go back and forth as we're going through the content to see what we can pull in, what we might want to wait to use at the end. But when you're evaluating your timely warning policy, you're looking for specific elements. So one, those circumstances under which the institution issues a timely warning. Two, who issues the timely warning, so what individual or department is responsible for making those decisions for your campus community. If there's a consultation process, is that reflected in your policy? And then the dissemination methods for the warning. So what are the mechanisms through which you communicate with your campus community when these incidents occur? So another quick poll that we want to launch just to get a sense for the folks that are involved in this particular webinar is, are you involved, so the person or persons participated in the webinar, because I know for some of you there are multiple folks in the room, are you involved in determining whether or not to issue a timely warning at your own institution? So you can go ahead and answer that poll, and you can see the results for other institutions on the screen. And that's probably what we would expect, that a good portion of you on the webinar attending probably play some role in issuing that timely warning, whether it's you're consulting as part of the process, whether you're the key decision maker, but it's really working to make sure that you have an understanding of what your policy says and how you enact it. For those of you who do not play a role in issuing timely warnings, it'd be interesting to know if anything we've already shared thus far really countered what your understanding was of timely warnings. One of the things we want to explore, and both during this webinar but also during the course of NACSAM, is what are the ways in which we help our campus community understand how we make decisions around alerting, when we'll send an alert, and when we choose not to send an alert. Timely warnings are not know to be in the know. They are not constructed in such a way that the campus community is expected to be notified about every single incident that takes place. There are a number of scenarios in which an incident can occur, a Clery Act crime and Clery Act geography, but it doesn't represent a serious or ongoing threat. Maybe the incident has been contained, an individual has been arrested. There are other steps that the institution has taken to mitigate that individual or that incident from being an ongoing threat to the campus community, and that's what you'll document for your institution. So we want to make sure that individuals understand that timely warnings are shared with our campus community so that they have information that they might need to know to impact or influence their own safety. And then moving on to another chat box question, with that in mind, we would love to know what steps you take to ensure that your timely warning accurately reflects your policy accurately reflects your procedures. So one of the things we sometimes see in program reviews is that institutions will have one policy in place, but when the Department of Education does a program review and really looks at the implementation of that policy, the institution's actual procedures are very different than what's communicated in the policy. And that's a problem in itself because they all should drive one another, right? Your policy is reflected in your policy statement. Your procedures are that you're implementing on campus reflect what's in that policy. So your procedures guide your policy statement, and so on and so forth in a cycle. So what steps do you take to ensure that your timely warning policy actually aligns with what your procedures are, the steps that you'd actually take when you're considering whether or not to issue a timely warning? Great. So one thing we're already seeing is Clery Committee is educated. People who have responsibilities for timely warning are on committee. So right there, we already see something that not every institution has accomplished yet, but we would always recommend. Do you have a Clery team or a working group? How well informed is the Clery team or working group on what the timely warning policy says and what the expectations are? And that might extend beyond people who are actually responsible for implementing it so that others can be ambassadors for the work that you do and help to communicate the goals of timely warnings, what they're intended to do or not do. We have a flow chart and a committee, so great. So you take elements of your policy and you really try to make them practical and usable for the individuals who have to implement it on a regular basis. Ensure that we get senior administrators in the room immediately, and as observers, we fill out an incident form on our portal online. So in your policy development, you already considered for the decision makers, are they individuals who are going to actually be able to quickly decide whether or not a timely warning needs to go out. So we don't have folks carved into our process that may not be able to respond or make these decisions in a timely manner. Provide users of our emergency system a training and provide all users of the team the policy along with the scenarios. So doing some practicing, we know that especially with our systems, we might practice over and over, and that doesn't mean that it'll be perfect or our systems will be perfect. We had that at the start of this webinar where our tech is working, we launched the webinar, and it decides to mess with us. So it is great to see that you have systems in place to really regularly check in with how your systems are used and what this looks like in practice, doing some case studies, really making sure that everyone is on the same page before you're actually implementing it. What we don't want to do is to figure out that we don't have a clear picture of how to implement our policy in the moment in which we are analyzing whether or not a timely warning needs to go out. So that's really great. We saw a lot of really good examples here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand it back over to Laura, who's going to talk through how you could use a timely warning guide to explore some of the things that you all are saying you'd like to do in relation to your timely warning policies and procedures.
Great. Thanks so much, Abby. So yeah, today we're going to walk through this timely warning guide. This is something that we developed because we knew that folks were starting to want to have a structure that would help them go through their own timely warning policy and procedures, see where there might be some things that they would like to change or alter or revise. But as with many things with Clery, folks are often struggling to figure out where they would start. And so we hope that this guide provides a helpful structure to, at minimum, just start thinking through those questions or making those sorts of analyses. And so this actual guide is linked in the files pod that you got the handout version of the slides from as well. It's that second link there. And so we're just going to kind of walk through it step by step and let you know what our intentions were when we were developing each section or what we hope that you'll get out of each section. And so the first part I'm going to talk through is really just the introduction and who should use this guide and how you can use this guide. So we recognize that it is a privilege for campuses to have anybody with the title of Clery Compliance Coordinator, even if that's an add-on title. let alone that, having somebody that's a full-time Clery compliance person is so truly rare. So what we have seen in addition to those types of models, and what we even find to be more beneficial, even if you do have a Clery compliance coordinator, is to have a multidisciplinary team that works across campus partnerships to institutionalize Clery compliance. We have always stressed that this is the best model to really achieve compliance at that institutional level because it allows for multiple areas on a campus to be engaged with how they fit into Clery compliance and how they can make that happen. So this particular guide is structured that one person could use it and benefit from it, or a team or a group of people could use it and benefit from it. Just walking through this guide or using the guide could be a really helpful task for a Clery compliance committee or for a subcommittee on a Clery compliance team that is dedicated to policy analysis or policy refreshment. This is a great guide for even if you don't have a group that is called a Clery compliance team. Maybe you have a board or even a group of just senior level administrators or non-senior level administrators that work on the ground with policy development or policy enactment, and that group could also benefit from using this as a guide, or even just one person that is looking through an ASR or responsible for making sure your ASR policy statements align with your procedures could benefit from using this guide. So it is not something that is exclusive to one type of person or one type of role. We really think that anybody could benefit from having a guided way to think about tackling a problem like how do we make our timely warnings better, more efficient, more useful, et cetera. And the way we've structured the document, if you want to open it up and look at it with me for a moment, is each of these sections that are highlighted on the very first page in the table of contents opens essentially with an objective, and then action steps to take, and then points to consider in regards to those action steps. So the first section that Abby will walk through in a moment with you on policy analysis essentially names what we think the objective would be if you're going to analyze your timely warning policy, steps to take to accomplish that objective, and then points to consider along the way. You'll see on the introduction page as well, in case you did want to present this to a group to get approval, essentially to launch a project group or a focus group or a subcommittee to do this work that's charged with this work. There is some background information on the first page that kind of summarizes what Abby was just walking through with what Clery requires around timely warnings, where it says that campuses are required to do this, and how all this work is always best accomplished through support from multiple entities, whether that looks like a team or whether that looks like one person coordinating efforts across other departments and not necessarily functioning as a team per se. We just always are going to support that as the most efficient. So that's kind of how to use this guide and how to walk through it. We definitely welcome feedback on all of our resources, but particularly ones like this, because we do know how often we get questions on timely warning application and analysis. So if you find something that you wish would be in a guide like this, or you found something in this very helpful, please do not hesitate to let us know. But I am actually going to now toss it back to Abby, who's going to walk through the policy analysis section of the document with you all.
Great. We actually just started talking about this a little bit, and some of you, when you were responding to the last question, commented we have a process of annually reviewing our policy to make sure that it represents the issuance procedures. And I think that's really wonderful because some campuses, when we are doing annual security report reviews with our members, oftentimes what we'll find is that we'll ask questions about, well, how does a policy work, or why is it worded in this way? And sometimes it'll turn out that maybe a policy changed a couple of years ago and it never was up, that language wasn't updated in the ASR, or it'll be something where they'll take a step back and say, well, I'm not actually sure why we do it in that way. It's just something that the institution has done forever and we never changed it. So really adding it to the agenda, saying we are going to intentionally take some time and look at our policy, and doing that on an annual basis really just helps to make sure that you are comfortable and confident about your policy and how it's being implemented on the campus. You might do this review and say, wow, we feel that we are following the policy exactly how it's written. We think that it's really effective. We don't have any concerns about implementation. And then we'll accurately reflect that in our annual security report. Whereas sometimes you might take a step back and say, well, we just realized that our policy is actually creating a lot of different layers that are slowing down our ability to send a timely warning in a reasonable manner as quickly as we possibly could. So you might start recognizing, well, there are gaps that we didn't realize were there, but this is an opportunity to fix them. So for the policy analysis section of the timely warning guide, it does what a lot of you just said that you might do on a regular basis, which is, one, ask yourself the question of whether or not a revision of existing policy or a creation of a new policy is required. Some campuses will say, well, we went to go do our policy analysis and realized we don't actually have a policy. So we have protocol, we have certainly steps the institution takes to issue a timely warning, but it was never actually grounded in an institutional policy as the Clery Act required. So you might find that particular action item. Or you might find that you have to revisit the circumstances through which your institution issues a timely warning. So we talked about the requirements speak to a Clery Act crime in Clery geography reported to a CSA or local law enforcement, and that represents a serious or ongoing threat. But you might learn that in practice, actually your institution has been using timely warnings or the language of timely warnings in ways that weren't represented in your policy. Maybe you have a template that you've been working with to send information through an online system or an email system, and you learn that timely warnings or things labeled as timely warnings were being sent for things such as a closing for a snow day or something that wouldn't truly fall under a timely warning. So part of your policy analysis is really looking at what are the circumstances in which we say we'll issue a timely warning. Does the language itself represent a case-by-case analysis of the information that we have, or does language say we're going to send out a timely warning for every Clery Act crime that's reported to the institution? Sometimes there can be accidental language in policies that really create structures that you didn't intend to create. This is why looking at other institutions' policies can be really helpful, but remembering that you want to make sure that whatever your final policy looks like aligns with the culture and structure at your institution, what's going to be a good fit for your own campus. We already talked about how for timely warning policies, they can be broader than their requirements as long as they're applied consistently, but also remember that that's what the Department of Education then is going to be looking for and what you're going to be held accountable to should you go in that direction. And you want to make sure that you're aligning your policy statement, and your procedures, and that you're documenting any gaps or potential changes you might need to make. So think about the places in which you've had to go and update your policies and procedures in other areas. Are you being as intentional and thoughtful around timely warnings as you might have been right after the release, for example, of the Violence Against Women Act amendments to Clery, when you went back to the drawing board to say, are our policies for dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking as comprehensive as they need to be? So if it's been some time since your campus has really looked carefully at that policy, then this first policy analysis is a good starting point. For some of you, you might be moving on to the next step and exploring or going more broadly than just this policy analysis. So I'm going to hand it over to Laura, who's going to talk about looking at your procedures.
Great. Thank you so much, Abby. So when you're thinking through issuing procedures, you really want to take into account some of the concerns that you all were bringing up earlier. What is your current process for determining whether or not a timely warning needs to be issued, and then getting that actual act of issuing the timely warning approved as a step, and then getting the language that would go out in that timely warning approved? And the reason we're spending so much time talking about this is because it is not unique to any particular campus, that this process can be a little bit arduous at times and a little bit overly complicated. And we know for sure from things that the Department of Education has written in program reviews as well as said in public arenas that they are not happy when they see that campuses have an unnecessarily complicated process to issue a timely warning. specifically if it is one that would delay the issuance of a timely warning anywhere from 24 to 48 hours, they would have a real problem with that. They are looking for people that are closer to the ground in terms of responding to these types of incidents to be empowered to issue timely warnings, while at the same time recognizing the balance and need for a campus to be concerned about the way they are putting out any sort of outward-facing messaging. So what we recommend doing is first getting very clear on the entirety of the process as it exists right now. Because I guarantee you, if you do have a group of folks that get together to determine whether or not a timely warning is issued, they each might have a different interpretation of what is required to first determine that a timely warning needs to be issued and then to actually send that warning. And there are many times where we see that the way something is described in an annual security report is not an accurate reflection of what is actually taking place. And this is across all areas of Clery compliance, as Abby was even mentioning earlier today. So you first want to make sure that you're clear on what the steps are that are actually happening on your campus to get a timely warning approved and to get it sent out. And then you want to evaluate if that's effective. Are all people that should be at the table to make that determination included? Are all people that are currently included actually helpful to the process, or is there any extraneous folks? And then you really want to move to creating that decision matrix for determining whether or not to issue. Basically, this part of your process is your opportunity to examine whether or not we do standardize anything, or if we have an opportunity to further standardize the actions that we take in this arena. Consistency is your friend when it comes to Clery compliance across multiple areas. And one piece that the Department of Education really stresses across the board, I would think most risk management folks would understand this as well, is you want to have procedures that are consistent. You don't want to do a lot of decision making, particularly for situations that do require case-by-case analysis. You don't want to be making decisions based on arbitrary factors. You want to still retain the ability to make a decision on a case-by-case basis using a standardized set of factors and considerations so that all of the decisions that you're making can be relied upon as consistent and fair and making sense, essentially. So when you're first completing that self-assessment, again, some of the questions we ask you to consider here are, how are we as an institution even operationalizing the phrase serious or ongoing threat? And that's like a little bit of a fancy way of saying, what does that mean on our campus? Serious or ongoing threat is the criteria that the Clery Act says you need to consider that would warrant issuing a timely warning. But what might be serious at a more rural institution might not rise to the level of serious at a more urban institution, or vice versa. So you want to make sure that you're really clear on what your particular campus's unique factors are for making this assessment of something being a serious or ongoing threat. So we have in our materials and trainings that we do, we have a sample timely warning decision matrix that we've created with some collaboration from folks at other institutions. But what that really looks like is a bunch of different tick marks and questions around factors to consider when issuing a timely warning. So beyond the more obvious elements of whether or not the perpetrator is apprehended, whether or not the perpetrator has made a verbal threat to do something similar to somebody else, other factors that might be a little bit more latent factors might be things like, have we received similar complaints about this type of perpetrator or this very perpetrator before? Is there a risk based on an event that's happening upcoming this weekend that would make this a more high-risk time should this action occur again than if this event was not taking place? Are we thinking collectively about the campus and the time of year that the incident is taking place? Does that make this more serious or less serious? Was there any maybe not explicit verbal things that were said, but do we have any other reasons to believe that this person is a threat and that they would perform this action again or a similar action again? So it's really helpful to come together as a campus and make some decisions around what would our criteria be? What sort of a matrix could we create and use so that we're standardizing our decision-making to a certain extent? And then lastly, when you're thinking about your issuing procedures, you really want to assess if your warnings are engaging and if they are actually reaching your whole community. So I know that a common concern with timely warnings is that they are longer because they require not only a description of the incident, but then prevention language and how to report language. And so traditionally, timely warnings have been sent via email. Many people, emails for students and even staff and employees today might as well be like a fax or a typewritten letter for other folks, right? So maybe folks aren't reading emails as much. So you're trying to look for another way to engage people. You might want to send a text message. So I've seen people issue a text message that says, go to this website for a timely warning. And there's a link or a hyperlink in that text, right? I would want to know if I was working on a campus, what is our data that people are actually clicking on that link and then reading that timely warning? Because what you want to make sure of is that your timely warnings are reaching the campus in some capacity. So it's also an appropriate time to think about what type of multimodal responses are you using. So if you do send an email, do you also send a text that says go to this website? Do you also send, put information up on a website? Do you use any of your LCD screens in common areas like a library or a student center to also display timely warnings? Are you using any other sort of method that would make sure that people are getting that message? Because we do understand that texts are definitely more reliable in terms of people actually seeing it. But if you are sending a timely warning, just through a link, you want to make sure that you have a way to verify that it's actually being read. And then on top of that, you want to make sure that the language in those timely warnings is readable, it's engaging, and it makes sense. And that kind of leads into our next section, which is talking through, talking through template constructions. So I'm going to pass it back to Abby to talk about that.
Right. Oh, I'm jumping too far ahead. So template construction is one of the areas, I think some of the pushback or concerns that we hear when working with campuses is you may have a lot of people in your community that have a lot of opinions about the decisions that you make. And many of you, just based on what you've said about your roles, are in positions where you are the ones essentially making the call as to whether or not what occurred within your campus community is a serious or ongoing threat. And the thing that we always caution campuses about or around is we really encourage collaboration in a number of different places. We talked about why a Clery team is important. That doesn't mean, though, that in the execution of timely warnings that you want to have a lot of people at the table. You want to have key decision makers. Many of you are those key decision makers that know the policy, that are have the skill and the ability to make these difficult decisions. So going back to what Laura talked about, can really analyze whether or not an incident is a serious or ongoing threat, looking at or using some of the factors that your own institution takes into consideration, which can be a variety of things, such as when the incident took place, was the suspect known to the individual, was there a relationship between the suspect and the person who was harmed, is the person in custody, were there prior arrests, is there a history of violent behavior, is there a no contact order, all of these different things that you are going to be doing. So not everyone is going to be involved in making those decisions. We want to work to build a community that can place trust and has trust in the policy and the people who make these decisions, which is easier said than done. But one of the places in which you can start to broaden or build those relationships is to think about if they're not going to be a part of the actual decision making, but they are looking, if they do have questions or they're looking to provide feedback, consider whether or not they might be involved in a process of creating templates to use for timely warnings. And the reason that we say this is we've had a number of different campuses that have had members of their community express concerns related to the language used in timely warnings, or whether or not the prevention tips, because your timely warning includes both information about the incident that occurred and information that members of your community can do to hopefully avoid this incident from happening to them or prevent this incident from happening again in the future. There may be individuals within your campus community that have a lot of skill or expertise in being able to provide this kind of feedback. So opening up the door for suggestions or feedback from other subject matter experts within the community can help you both better understand what information is most helpful to include in a timely warning, and it helps you to have these nuanced conversations when you don't have the factor of time influencing those decisions. So in the template construction section, so as you look at the timely warning guide, the next piece that you'll see is really exploring this area. Now, we know that it is impossible to think of every possible scenario. So when you're making a decision as to whether or not something is a serious or ongoing threat, we know that you're paying attention to the many different factors that are occurring as a part of that particular incident. I know we've had some questions come in about what constitutes a serious or ongoing threat. We want to get through some of these examples, and then towards the end we are leaving space for additional questions. So we can certainly share additional factors that other campuses point to when making that analysis. But that said, we know you can't make a template for absolutely everything. But we do know that you might find that there are certain types of incidents that are unfortunately happening more often within your campus community, or even just starting by looking at what those Clery Act crimes are and the nature of the types of incidents that may occur can give you a good starting point. And so for template construction, what we suggest as part of this particular activity is to first create an outline of information that the institution would incorporate into a timely warning. So at a minimum, you include specific information about the incident that occurred. It's not intended to be general prevention. It's intended to speak specifically to an incident that represents a serious or ongoing threat to the campus community. Another element is the prevention information itself, speaking to the incident that occurred. So again, not broad or general, but really looking to what happened in this circumstance and what are specific steps that we would recommend individuals within our community to take. And then a lot of institutions also include information related to reminders of how to make a report. Some institutions also connect help or support or resources, because we know that sometimes the side effect of our timely warnings are more people coming forward and reporting when they recognize that they've experienced a similar type of incident and that support and information is available within the community. So once you have a sense of the structure of your timely warnings, which certainly you can look to past timely warnings to figure out what does that look like right now, you can create templates that contain the elements of an outline that the institution can point to or use when creating or applying timely warnings. So for example, there are many institutions that will look specifically to that prevention language, and they will create sentences or paragraphs or sections of information with suggestions related to prevention. So a good question to ask yourself is, do you have members of your community that prevention is a primary role of the work that they do? And how might you take some of these concepts that we're using in other spaces, for example, bystander intervention, and incorporate them into timely warnings? One of the areas where we've seen a lot of pushback at institutions is when members of the community feel as though timely warnings are victim blaming. So they are being used in such a way that the individual who was the victim of the initial crime feels as though they made a wrong decision and that's why that crime occurred. And we know that it's a difficult balance because you're taking one incident, or sometimes a pattern, you've recognized that it's a serious or ongoing threat to the campus community, and so you're trying to communicate prevention information, but also being sensitive to the needs of the individual who came forward in the first place. And bystander intervention tends to be a really helpful or positive area to look to in order to do this. So for example, if we were looking at sexual assault in particular, some of the prevention tips might be tied to what bystanders can do if they see uncomfortable or concerning behavior. It could have information, as many campuses do, around consent and what individuals need to do to obtain consent. So having these conversations and working together to create these templates really helps you to have some of these nuanced conversations in advance of an incident occurring. Template construction can also, depending on how you send out your timely warning, it could also tie to even just the structure of how you organize information and how it's shared. So that's where individuals like marketing and communications or graphics might come into play. So depending on how you're sending out your email, there might be a way that either organize your paragraphs or the way that you structure your text or the visuals in the warning itself that might influence or make it more likely that someone's going to read that warning. Not everyone, I know, years ago, in my college experience, timely warning included a lot of pieces of paper on the doors of classroom buildings. Campuses have moved away from that in some capacity because we do have so much more available to us with technology that certainly wasn't available then. But it's something to consider for those of you that are still doing, a print or email version of timely warnings. A template might be not just the content, but also how the warning itself is being displayed, how it's being viewed, how it's getting to the device, or the way in which an individual is looking at the warning itself. Laura, would you have anything to add to that or any suggestions based on what's in that template construction section that you would want to highlight in particular?
I really just love the idea of the peer review. I think you were mentioning this a little bit already, but I just cannot stress enough how valuable it is to get input from other parties on campus, whether that be students or staff or folks that are thinking about things particularly from a wellness perspective or a trauma-informed lens, as well as your campus safety folks. Is the information that you're including preventing them from moving forward with an investigation? Is it something that everybody can stand behind? And I honestly think that it's such a great recommendation for all of your outward-facing Clery pieces, like your ASR as well. But I really just am a big fan of doing that, and it kind of ties in nicely to the next section as well, if you would want me to move on, Abby.
Yeah, I think that sounds great.
Great, thank you. So for educating your campus community, this is a section that developed, honestly, from some great ideas that we had generated, that other folks had generated, rather, and shared with us that we had really liked. A lot of this comes from, or a lot of these ideas come from the idea that it is helpful and good to hear from challenging voices. So many campuses get a lot of negative feedback about their timely warnings all the time, whether it's not the right language or they don't offer them frequently enough or they issue them too frequently enough. So some campuses that we have worked with have actually developed procedures or practices to engage their campus community in further understanding what the intentions of a timely warning are, and then have given them space to express if they have any dissatisfaction with those intentions or if the way that's executed on their campus. So these are just some ideas that we have, but this is certainly an area where we encourage you to flesh it out more with your campus's own culture and personality in mind. But we suggest to create a social norming campaign that explains the intention and purpose of timely warnings, just in general. And then in addition to that, you could either create a separate norming campaign, or we find it really helpful to create either a video or separate written materials that explain the differences between timely warnings and emergency notification. And you might even call these things something different on your campus. You are permitted to, as long as they are separate and distinct and follow the criteria for the separate and distinct types of alerts under Clery. But, and we recognize too that you might do all of this and people will still be confused and people will still complain or push back or challenge. And that is okay. That's, expected. But I think what would be helpful is if you have some of these pieces in your back pocket ready to show, as opposed to feeling like you have to start all over from scratch about how to even explain what these things are. So these are helpful resources and tools to develop and then to have in your arsenal of ways to describe things and share information with your campus community. The last piece is honestly one of my favorites. We saw a campus that had a lot of pushback from students and staff about a lot of different language that they use. So not just language connected to timely warnings, but many outward-facing communications. And so the campus held a series of town hall meetings that served as a public forum for the campus to hear the concerns of the community, address them when appropriate, and then they took all of that feedback and essentially developed sample language that then students and staff continued to provide feedback on. And then they developed that language into a couple of guides that the campus uses when creating either template language or non-template language for their warnings or their communications around campus safety. And that's from just an inclusion lens, diversity lens, as well as a trauma-informed lens also. So there is a lot of benefit, I think, in gaining varied perspectives around what people already think timely warnings are and why they're used. We, send this message out a lot from Clery. Some people just are really misunderstanding that the purpose of a timely warning is not necessarily to just put you on notice that something happened, but rather to let you know that something happened that has the potential to occur again and could be really harmful. And so you might want to consider some changes to make to your own behavior so as to avoid becoming involved in that type of an incident. And so with that, that's a distinct difference than just a heads up, all these crimes are happening in this area, or even heads up, this happened and there is no more risk. And it's not to say that those types of warnings or alerts are not helpful in their own right, and some campuses, might still always choose to do some sort of a daily crime alert or a daily notice, but timely warnings are distinctly different. And so the more you can do to educate yourself on that difference and that intention, and share that with your campus community, the more buy-in you'll have for any time that you do decide to issue one or not. And so we just think this is also an opportunity to get really creative. And so it leads into the final discussion on campus partnerships that could be really valuable to explore, because you could make this, the social norming campaign piece could be a project for a senior marketing class that needs to have a semester-long project or internship type piece that they need to accomplish. This could also be something that you would ask for volunteer experience from students, from staff, if there are people that are interested in making a video that explains the differences between these two types of warnings, anything that would be very engaging and helpful to make sure that campus community members are clear on why campuses make the decisions that they do. And then, also, it does hold you accountable. So, this can be why some people maybe have veered away from putting a lot of effort into explaining the purpose of timely warnings or emergency notification, because it does put a lot of light and attention on what you're doing around very sensitive issues on a campus. And it helps, though, to show, if you are doing that, if you're not afraid to shed that kind of light, that you do want to be held accountable for the decisions that you're making. And when I say you, I mean the institution. And so you want your campus community to fully understand the circumstances in which you would or would not issue a warning, so that they feel like they are being told, the clearest, honest version of events that are happening in and around their campus. And that if they don't think that that's happening, that they have the ability to challenge that, to question that, and who they should reach out to do those things. So it's just a really valuable piece here. And another, helpful thing that I really learned just through my time in working with Clery and working with timely warning education is partnerships with any sort of student government or student media and your campus safety offices or services are so invaluable when it comes to educating as many folks as possible on campus safety requirements or policies or procedures. You, as a campus safety department, might have your own Twitter and might have your own Facebook or whatever, but campus students tend to be more inclined to read that message when it comes from a peer. It's just about that credible messenger piece. So if your student government has an Instagram that campus safety takes over, quote unquote, for a week, that actually could be a really valuable partnership to getting a message out to your students. And so that could come hand in hand with maybe doing a week-long campaign dedicated to explaining the different types of alerts that your campus safety uses and why. So just a couple of ideas here. Again, it's a place to get really creative, but it's a part that we often think gets forgotten about. You do all this hard work, but then how do you communicate to your campus what you do? So I'm going to turn it back over to Abby for the last part of the guide, which is talking through some campus partnerships that you could explore.
Great. So we've been talking a lot about bringing in these partners. So there are a couple of things that we would just suggest that you consider. On the slide there is a list of many of the folks that we've already mentioned. We did use the language of victim advocates, but we also recognize, to some of our conversation from earlier, that there might be a lot of folks working in the prevention lens, not necessarily directly in victim advocacy, that could still inform your work. But Laura has already highlighted a lot of these roles in relation to communications, student government, or students in general, even if that's student media, emergency management. So some campuses do have different structures or systems for who is sending a timely warning versus who is issuing an emergency notification. So making sure that all of the different partners are clear about what their roles are and what the policies say is certainly critical. And then we would just encourage you to think about how do we think about these timely warnings as a reflection of our institution as a whole? And if so, how do we incorporate our institutional mission and values into that language? So when I am reading, as a member of your community, when I am reading that timely warning, do I interpret that warning through the values that your institution is really trying to communicate, which is, from what I've seen, certainly working with all of you across the country, which is care for the members of your community. We want you to know about information that might affect your safety. We want you to know there are people out here who will help you and support you if and when an issue occurs. So think of timely warnings as two arenas. One, they're certainly an angle of compliance. They're making sure that we're communicating if and when we need to. But the second part of that is also one of the ways in which we say to members of our community, we are going to be transparent and share information with you, and we actively want you to come forward and share information with us. So we put here the question of, do we want individuals to report? And certainly probably when you read that you think, of course, yes, we want people to report. We'd rather the crimes not occur, but if they do occur, we want them to come forward. But we ask the question here because the implications matter for your institution, right? If we, as an institution, want people to come forward, if we want to have a culture of reporting, that means that we're going to need more people responding. That means that our statistics are more likely to go up before they go down. And so is our campus culture one in which that not just all of the individuals involved in implementing timely warnings, but leadership and other roles that might need to communicate about who made a decision and why, really align with this philosophy of we share information because we are here for the safety of our campus community, and that we share information according to our policies. Do they know, or will they point to the experts, so to speak, the decision makers, as to why you did what you did? And that's an angle that Clery Center really frequently winds up, or a role I should say that Clery Center really winds up playing, is speaking to leadership on campus so that they understand that we want to have these policies created in such a way that the people who are tasked with making these decisions are able and confident to make these decisions, and they're not undermined or detracted from doing so in a way that's helpful to the campus community in any way. And then recognizing, too, that aspects of campus culture that contribute or can contribute to or take away from trusting messages like timely warnings. So, for example, one of you in a private conversation asked whether or not we could broadly address reluctance to include race of the suspects in a timely warning. And I think that ties well with what we're talking about here, because if members of your community feel as though decisions aren't being made with the best kind of thought or meaning in mind, which is if they're seeing things in your messaging that makes them feel as though the institution is not a safe or welcoming place to go and make a report, then they're going to be less likely to come forward. And so for a lot of institutions, this question of whether or not to use race in a timely warning ties into all of that, because where we have concerns and where institutions have had to tackle this issue or navigate this question is where there isn't any consistency in decision making about whether or not to include a description. Race alone does not, I would say in almost every circumstance, does not give you enough information about the alleged perpetrator for someone to be able to change their own actions or decisions. Now, we have seen scenarios in which race was included in timely warnings because there were other descriptors outside of race, but used in tandem with race, that actually helps to paint a picture to members of the campus community about an individual that could present concern to the campus. So you really want to make sure that you're having this conversation in your campus community. What factors, what information do we include in our timely warnings? Are we doing so consistently? And are we sure that we are not specifically targeting or only using descriptors in relation to certain members or individuals within our community? And I think that that extends to some of what we were talking about also in relation to victim blaming or the other language that you include in the warning. There are so many ways in which we intentionally or unintentionally communicate a message. So our warnings, even if we don't explicitly say it, can either communicate, we're here for you, we want to help you, or they can unintentionally say when you come forward, it's going to be a challenge or a problem for our institution. And sometimes that's unintentional. So that's really why we create guides like this, so that your campus can have some of these difficult conversations and really be considering how your decisions impact those members of the campus community. Laura, would you have anything to add to that before we tackle maybe some of these closing questions before the end of the webinar?
No, I don't think so. I think you really covered it all.
So there were a couple more questions as we wrap it up that we want to address, especially because it was a theme. We won't be able to get to all of the questions because we are almost out of time. But one of the kind of trends that was coming up was, can you talk more about factors to determine whether or not a serious or ongoing threat exists? And I would say as part of these conversations, you want to sit down with other members of your community and talk about what factors are we looking at when making this consideration. We talked about the importance of a timely warning decision matrix. Your decision matrix can have information on factors that either to you escalate the problem to be a serious or ongoing threat, or mitigating factors. So some of the things, none of these we would point to as a standalone, but some of the things you might point to are things such as whether or not the suspect threatened to commit physical violence. Are there available facts to determine whether or not there's a threat or no threat? So what was the mechanism through which this report came in, and what level of information or details do you have about the report itself? Are there circumstances in which you are identifying predatory behavior or a pattern of behavior that represents a serious or ongoing threat? Was there a particular tool that was used to perpetrate this offense? So, for example, when we're talking about things like sexual violence, was there use of drugs or intoxicants? Are there other patterns of behavior? Have we received reports of similar offenses that would identify to us that there can be a pattern? It doesn't necessarily have to be a pattern. So even one incident could represent a serious or ongoing threat. Some other things you might consider is whether or not there are multiple victims, whether or not the incident itself or the threats made during the incident related to physical violence, when the individual potential perpetrator is known to the community. Are there steps in place that might mitigate it from being a serious or ongoing threat? Is there a no contact order in place? Is there a history of violating no contact orders? Has there been an immediate suspension? So by the time this report came in, has the institution already taken steps to limit this person's access to either the individual or to the campus as a whole? I think I already mentioned things like prior arrest or history of violent behavior. So I can't give you a concrete full list of serious or ongoing threats, but that is the conversation that your institution wants to have. And some of you were talking about whether or not there are templates available. Some institutions share their resources publicly, so it's always good for an online search. And you can always send us an email directly to follow up if you're looking for resources like that, if you're building your own decision matrix or the like. Laura, are there any other patterns or trends in the questions that you think it would make sense or that we have time to answer before we close today?
The biggest one was just exactly what you said, and I'm getting a lot of questions about, do we have sample timely warning templates or decision matrix templates? And so I gave the same answer that you just did, that we don't maintain any per se in terms of sample timely warning templates, but I would advise folks to reach out to other peer institutions or even pose that question in the group discussion pod for this webinar to see what other folks do share or use. We do include an activity around developing your own timely warning template as well as a sample timely warning decision matrix in our 3-day training program that you could access in person or online. But we recognize that's another cost for some folks, so we don't want to make that seem like that's the only way to get that information. So we do definitely encourage you to reach out to other campuses or see the templates that, yes, other campuses do make public when they issue a timely warning, for sure.
Right. So our colleague Amy did plug in a survey. We would love to get your feedback on what you took away from this webinar, if there are other things that you're looking to do. We host webinars throughout the year, not just for National Campus Safety Awareness Month, so the information you provide to us helps us create other learning opportunities in the future. One thing that I'll flag before we leave, just because I think this is also a common trend or question related to timely warnings, is you mentioned the Department of Education is looking at the time frame that the timely warning wasn't sent. What is the best practice time frame for timely warnings? So there isn't a specific time frame laid out in the law. We as an organization actually advocated against that because we know discretion is important. We know the information that you receive on what time you receive it can really vary. But you as an institution want to consider what is timely, what you consider to be timely. I would say some of the program reviews really speak to lengths of time where if you took 24 to 48 hours, it is likely that that's going to be too long of a time to be issuing your timely warning. So we can't carve out the perfect window. A lot of it's going to depend on what information you have. But what I would go back to and look to is, do you have any layers in your policy or in the way that you implement your policy that could prevent it from being timely? So for example, the only person that might receive, say someone makes an online report, is the only person that might receive that report somebody who wouldn't receive it overnight if there were a report after hours? Are the individuals involved in decision making in roles where they're not readily available to be able to make these types of decisions? So those are the types of things that you'll want to think about. So again, please put in your, share your questions, share your feedback with us in the evaluation. We are happy to take that information and apply it to other learning opportunities. Laura, do you have anything to add, or do you want to close us out?
No, I don't have anything else to add. Thanks so much, Abby, and thank you so much to all of you for choosing to spend some of your day with us today. Please do take a moment to fill out the feedback form and that evaluation survey, as Abby mentioned, and please let us know either through that survey or through any other direct communication how you feel about the timely warning guide and if you think it is useful. Thank you again so much, and really appreciate all of your attention today. Hope you have a great rest of your day.